Hi, I'm Pete Lockett. I'm here at Online Lessons to talk about the Indian rhythmic system and the vocalizations and syllables that we find within that system. Now, before we move on to rhythm languages and spoken rhythms, um, first of all, let's just look at a global picture because it's not just particular to India that we find, recitation of rhythm. In the Arabic world, we have, dum and tak and syllables that are used for many different drums. Japanese kuchi shawa, which is the recitation you get with taiko drumming. Javanese kendang, which is a double-ended drum that has syllables. Awe drumming from Ghana, syllables are used. The batar drums from Santeria, and even modern-day beatboxing, and many other actual drums and traditions that use syllables for reciting rhythm that are then played on drums. Now, the thing that distinguishes India apart from these is that all of these other traditions are really based on drum sounds, purely drum sounds, and no abstract system as such is derived from them. So the Indian system is completely different in that an abstract rhythmic system is developed with the syllables. Now, these Indian rhythm language it really been it's kind of a pure science of rhythm that's been developed over many centuries, and we go back to the 2nd century BC, and that's the first record that there is of recitation and clapping. And if we go back to 600 BC, we have the first actual patronage of this art form. So basically, by that I mean someone was paying someone to develop that art form at that point. So clapping and recitation goes back, as far as we can, kind of see into history, really, in the Indian, area. Now, the system itself has developed so strongly because of this idea of clapping time cycles and reciting abstract rhythms. And one of the things that's quite different from this to many other musics around the world is this concept of time cycle, a longer passage of time that's notated with claps, waves, finger counts, lots of different ways to create markers of time. And what happens in performance is this becomes such an important and integral part of the music of North and South India that there's always someone or something on stage that's marking out where these long time cycles are, how they're, topped and tailed. So in the north of India, normally this will be done when you're learning drums and when you're learning different instruments. You learn to clap and recite syllables to learn basic rhythms. But in performance in North India, there's a different way of doing it. So say for example we have sitar and tabla playing as a duo, then if they would never both solo at the same time, very, very rarely, if ever. And so what happens is if the melody player is soloing, then the rhythm player would play a repetitive time cycle that marks out where the whole thing begins and ends. And similarly, the other way round, if the percussionist would be soloing, then the melody player would play a repetitive melody that specifically marks the length of the time cycle. In South India, it's a little bit different in that there's pretty much always someone on stage clapping a time cycle. So if it was a singer, then they would clap the time cycle themselves 9 times out of 10. If there was no singer, so everyone's hands are being used with their instruments, the violin, for example, or whatever, then there'll be someone separately there specifically to clap the time cycle. So this idea of the time cycle being conducted throughout the whole, musical all of the musical works in the classical music of North and South India, is critically important to understand how this rhythmic system has developed in such detail over so many centuries. That and the patronage of people being, paid to develop their art, in the same way that Western classical music composers were, brought into the court of a prince or a king or whatever, and given 2 or 3 years to write 2 symphonies or an opera or whatever, they were given to do. And so that's why some of these music have developed, in a very intellectual way, alongside other musics, the folk musics and other musics that have kind of been, going along in the way that they have been throughout time, with a less extreme peak of intellectual development. Of course, both musics are equally valid and great, and it's not a judgment that I'm proposing here, but just explaining how and why these things happen. So the concept of cycle is vitally important in this whole system, the whole vocalization system that happens in the Indian rhythm. So if we focus in now on India and we look at what we have, obviously India is a huge country. There are many different styles of music across India. I mean, literally thousands of different folk styles and different drums and different instruments. But there are 2 main classical styles, and they are, in the north of India we have Hindustani classical music, and in the south we have Carnatic classical music. Now, across all of the traditions, the folk and the classical, the drums are always, or they always have syllables for the strokes on the drums. So, for example, if we look at the tabla from North India, we have the na stroke, which is the high-pitched sound on the rim. We have the ge stroke, which is the open bass sound. Ke, which is the closed sound on the bass tabla. We have tun, an open sound. Te on the black spot, and then we have compound syllables. So ge plus na, for example, becomes da. Ge plus te becomes te, dhe, dehe. So there's a very complex, particularly in the 2 classical areas, North and South, Carnatic and Hindustani. It becomes a very elaborate way of notating or reciting patterns exactly as they would be played on the drums. Now, once we start to look at the vocalization of this in India, a lot of people kind of just have a blanket term of konakol. And it's a lot more detailed than that. First of all, we have to look at what, the different things that we have in India. So, there's drum syllables, there's dance syllables, there's different syllables between different drums, there's syllables that are used that don't actually mean anything, that they're just merely frameworks or poetic recitation. So there's many different sorts. Now I'm just going to have a little look at kind of 4 of the main types of vocalization that you get in India. Now the first that we're going to look at is konakol or solkatu. It means the same thing. Now, konakol is from the Telugu word of koni, which is to say, and kol, which means rule or reign. So kind of the rule of the words, would be a literal translation. And solkatu, similarly, would translate into soul, meaning vocal syllables, and katu, which is a bunch or a group, so a bunch of syllables. So konakol and solkatu are South Indian terms that you find that describe the vocalizations that you get in South India. Now, of course, as I said, these are very specific in that the sounds, the syllables represent strokes on the drums in many instances. We're going to get into more detail with that, a little bit later on. Now, the next style we have in South India is called Natwangam. Now, Natwangam is the vocal recitation that you get with Bharatanatyam dance, the classical dance of South India. Now, the Natwangam player is a very important person in the Bharatanatyam dance ensemble of musicians, in that they're pretty much leading leading the group, and it's a very complicated scenario, and I'm going to demonstrate some of this in a minute. But basically the syllables are playing, reciting what the Mridangam player is playing loosely, following the framework of that, whilst they have two hand bells that they play with the hands, which follow the feet of the dancer. So it's quite a complex thing to learn, and it's also slightly different. It's not the syllables that you would find in Mridangam, for example, the double-ended South Indian drum. It's a lot more poetic and poetic. Yeah, that's just the best way to describe it. It's very lyrical and flowing, and a lot of beautification with the words, and it's a very nice thing to listen to. Then if we go to North India, when you learn the tabla, it's like you're learning the bowls of the tabla, B-O-L-S, bolo, which kind of means in Hindi to speak. So you learn the bowls, which is the sounds like the ge, the na, the da, the tun that I was talking about earlier. And then when you string that together and you have passages of rhythm, and you recite that, when a tabla player would recite that, it's called tabla parant. So again, this is a completely different thing. The syllables are completely different than you'd find in the South. There are some similarities, some words you find in both, some phrases you find in both, but pretty much it's a very different kind of structure. And finally, the fourth thing that we're just going to briefly touch upon is Kathak Paramelu, which is the recitation that the North Indian Kathak dancer would recite. Now, again, this is very different than the tabla or the Bharatanatyam or the Konakol. Again, very different syllables that you'd find. So I'm just going to take you through an example of each, just so you can hear the difference. This isn't notated in the notes that you have with the lesson, but it's just going to give you an idea of the difference. Because what I don't want to do is people to think like this is all Konakol, because it's not. It's all very different rhythmic styles. So first of all, I'm going to look at an example that you'd find in South India on the Mridangam, the double-ended drum. Now, one of the things about these syllables is if you're playing different drums, such as the kanjira, that doesn't have that many different strokes on it, or the gatam, which is the clay pot, you still use and learn the same syllables. And even melody players, if they're going to learn their rhythms on their instrument, then they learn a set of syllables. So, the syllables are very important in the learning process. So I'm just going to recite a little bit of South Indian Mridangam style. So this is in 8/4. 5, 6, 7, 8. Ta dim. Na ta 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 dim. Na kita ta dim. Na titum kita ta kita ta dim. Dim tagadum tat dim na tat dim na titum kita ta dim na tat dim na kita dim na dim kita tat dim na titum kita tat dim na tat dim na titum kita talangdum titum kita talangdum titum kita talangdum takatatum tatikitatum tatikitatum ta. So this is a typical thing that you'd find in Mridangam and Kanjira and different South Indian classical drums. We have the recitation of basic groove, ta dim na ta, and then the solo phrase. So the basic idea is that they have the groove stuff and the solo phrase that gets introduced more and more regularly into the time flow, and then there's a composition to finish it up, kind of using those syllables. Now, the next one I'm going to look at from South India, and I'm not going to do the whole compositions of these because they're very long, but I'm just going to give you an idea of the flavour of them, and you can see the lyrical nature of the syllable. So this is Natwangam. So this is the syllable recitation that you'd hear with Bharatanatyam dance. Again, we're in 4/4, 8/4. da, gota ne, gota re, gota jum da, jum gata, jum tari jaka tari jana jana, kukundari takuntari kita taka tatakuta ne, gota re, gota jum da, jum gata, jum tari jaka tari jana jana, kukundari takuntari kita taka tatakuta ne, and so on and so forth. Now, the other thing that I mentioned earlier is the bells playing a different pattern. So the recitation is following what the mridangam player would be playing, and the clapping pattern would be following the feet of the dancer that all obviously have the bells on. You know, so again, this is in 4/4, but the recitation is a phrase that goes across the whole, you know, time flow, and the bells are 7 7 7 7 4. Okay, so that's what the dancer would be dancing. So the time is here. We're in 8/4. Takatari taka takita kita takata. Takita taka di, takita taka dum, takita taka nam, takita taka takatana, taka, takita kita takata, takita taka di, takita taka dum, takita taka nam, takita taka. So this is Natwangam. This is what you would typically hear recited with the Bharatanatyam dance, and you can hear how it's you know, it's a very lyrical kind of flowing, you know, nice words within the recitation. Now, of course, across the musical spectrum in South India, you get musicians who are specialists in different areas. So if you get a mridangam player who's a specialist in Bharatanatyam dance, then they're going to be much more lyrical with the syllables that they use on the mridangam. They're going to kind of import and export some of the stuff between the two areas. And because the mridangam player is normally the most senior person in the ensemble, even though it's led on stage by the Natwangam player, in terms of seniority, it's usually the mridangam player. The mridangam player quite often will compose the Natwangam compositions. In fact, my mridangam teacher was a great master called Karakudi Krishnamurti, and he was actually a specialist in Bharatanatyam dance. So for me, it was very advantageous because I learned a lot of the poetic recitation alongside the standard traditional South Indian mridangam recitation. So moving north, we're into you know, the tabla. Now, of course, there's so many different drums across, you know, the north and the south, and they kind of have, particularly in north, they kind of have different syllables as you go between the different drums, whether it's the tabla or the pakawaj, double-ended drum, or the kol, or, you know, different sort of instruments have slightly different you know, syllables that are used. So the basic syllables that we would find on tabla, as I said earlier, we have na, ge, ke, tun, te, da, de, dere, loads of different syllables that are used in the structure of the playing of the drums. Now, one of the things to bear in mind, just at this point, that I'm going to mention about the ambiguity of the syllables, you know, because some people misunderstand that it's a pure system where na is always na, and you know, the syllables always mean the same thing, and they don't. There's a lot of ambiguity. So, for example, the na stroke on the rim of the tabla can sometimes be ta. And similarly, ta can sometimes be, instead of on the rim, can be all four fingers on the black spot. It's confusing to people in the beginning, but it's just the same as in the English language. So if I was to say to you, just abstract through, without a context, you wouldn't have any idea what that meant. So only with the context does it mean something. So through the ball or through the window, and then it means something. And similarly, the syllables in terms of connection with the actual compositions, then you understand what they mean. And obviously, the more familiar you are with the instrument and the compositions, then the easier it is to understand exactly what syllables to play for which compositions. So that's tabla bowls. Tabla parant is actually the more of the recitation of tabla compositions. Now, this does happen a little bit in tabla solo. In South India, the recitation actually is becomes a big part of the what's called the Tani Arbitrum, the group, the solo of a group of drummers, basically. So in tabla parant can sometimes be used in a part of a solo, but normally it's small compositions and not big long compositions. So let's just have a look at a simple composition. I'm using the South Indian clapping system for this throughout, just to keep on continuity. But this is a North Indian composition. This is tabla parant, and this is what's called a fixed composition, a short rhythmic poem, if you like. Again, it's in 16 or 4 or 8. Tati kata tati kata takata takata dina takatina tita takata takata kinida. Krantra kita kita krantra kita kita krantra kita kita ta kot krantra kita kita krantra kita kita krantra kita kita ta kot tang kita kita kot ta. So this is a typical fixed composition that you would find in North India, tabla parant. Similarly, there are much longer compositions that you learn to speak when you're learning the drums, but not necessarily in recitation, in performance. But it's a very useful tool for learning the drums. So I'm just going to show you a couple of compositions that are called kaida, that they're theme and variation compositions. So this is tabla parant again. Datuna kita tak 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 kita dina datuna na dina kita tak 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 kita dati datun tatuna kita tak 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 kita dina dina na dina kita tak 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 kita dati dina. So this is tabla parant. This is a basic, that's the theme. So what they would do is they take that theme and they do it in single speed, 1.5 times the speed, double the speed, and once they got to double speed they'll do loads of variations, and the rules and regulations around those variations, that the variations can only contain the basic content and theme of the actual, first theme. So it's not like it can suddenly be free form and for example, in that composition, dede dede comes in, or a different stroke. Sometimes there are some, exceptions to that, but pretty much that's generally the rule. If we take another composition, I'm going to show you a theme going from single, 1.5 times speeds, and double. Again, it's in 4/4. Da gena dati da da dedicate da dati da gen dati da gena daga tuna gena ta gena dati da da dedicate da dati da gen dati da gena daga dina gen da gena dati da dedicate dati da dati da gena daga tuna gena da gena dati da dedicate dati da gena daga tuna gena da gena dati da dedicate dati da gen dati da gena daga tuna gena da gena dati da dati da dati da gena daga tuna gena da gena dati da gena da. So this is a typical theme going through 3 levels, and then they get to this point and do lots of different variations. Now finally, the 4th one that I discussed was Kathak Paramelu. So this is the recitation that would happen actually mainly in the dance class for the North Indian Kathak dance. Sometimes it would happen in performance as well. Now this is again a very different way of reciting. So for example, they'll often be kind of counting time. Ta te te ta 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 te te ta ta te te ta te te. They kind of count time a lot when they're kind of preparing and setting up compositions. So I'm just going to do a short composition that a Kathak dancer might recite in putting together a composition for performance. And again, you can see how that with all of these different things, the syllables are actually very different. Again, it's in 4/4. Da da digga da 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 granda da day da da day da da. Got a day, got a day, got a day. Got a day, got a day, got a day. Got a day, got a day, got a day. So you can see the syllables are are very different in this whole scenario. And other things they'll do with Kathak dancers that you don't get in Bharatanatyam dance, for example, they'll do a lot of footwork. So they've actually, the main foot pattern that they use is kind of like an offbeat paradiddle. But they'll also have lots of stickings like takita takita dina takita takita dina with the feet, with the bells, and the tabla players playing in unison, and they'll have big long compositions that they call chakradar that you also find in the tabla genre, and that chakradar is basically a big composition that happens 3 times and comes, full circle back to the downbeat. And another thing that they'll do is within these compositions is use numbers. So as if we were counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they will use numbers. So there's a composition in 8/4 or Tintal, which is kind of 16 beats really, is using the numbers. Okay, ek, do, din, ja, punch. Ek, do, din, ja, punch. Ek, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1. Ek, do, din, ja, punch. Ek, do, din, da, punch. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1. So this is, often you'd see Kathak dancers kind of using this type of method for, recitation and sharing compositions with the tabla player. Now, one crucial difference between many of the South and North Indian compositions, this is a small technical point, but it's quite an important point to understand. A lot of the South Indian, a lot of the North Indian compositions, are calculated in such a way as when it's something like a T-high, which is a phrase repeated 3 times, calculated to end on the first beat of the time cycle. The actual downbeat is included in each phrase. So, for example, in 4/4, takadina takadina da, da. So each phrase has the da at the end, and the da becomes the first beat. So basically, the downbeat is included in the calculations with a majority of North Indian, rhythmic, analysis and calculations. In the South, however, a lot of the material is calculated within the time frame. So, for example, tati kitatum tati kitatum tati kitatum ta, tati kitatum tati kitatum tati kitatum ta in 4/4. Now you notice that it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1. So we've had 3 groups of 5. The 5 isn't the downbeat. The next one is the downbeat. So all of their calculations are based on analysing what is between the 2 downbeats, not including the downbeat. Whereas if I was to do the same calculation in North India, it would sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm starting 1/16 later. So South Indian, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1. North Indian, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a subtle difference, and there are obviously exceptions going both ways to this. It's not an absolute rule and regulation, but it's just one of the differences that you find between the 2 systems. Of course, there are many, many other differences. We'll look at a little bit of that by analysing some of the South Indian material that we're going to analyse in a minute.